People love to brag about their car's top speed, or its cornering G, or its lap time, but in all honesty, it's kinda superfluous. 99 times out of 100, you'll never be able to do anywhere near those numbers. I mean, do you think a Bugatti owner has ever actually exceeded 150 miles an hour, much less 270? No. So the question shouldn't be how fast can you go? Instead, the question should be how fast can you get to the speed limits? And in that department, there is one stat that matters: 0 to 60 miles an hour. So let's track the history of 0 to 60 times to see how we've evolved. And before we get to the evolution of those times, let's first introduce the 0 to 60 mile an hour or 100 kilometer an hour test. It should be pretty simple. Car starts at 0 miles an hour, and the timer stops when the car hits 60 miles an hour. And it is that simple, except for one annoying little thing: the rollout. The 1-foot rollout was created in response to GPS technology being used in automotive performance timing. The subtraction of 1 foot of movement from the time was done to account for historical differences in timing. At least that's what the Americans who invented it say. Others will simply say that it was a cheat to make American cars look as fast as their European rivals when in actuality they weren't. And they're probably not far off in that aspect. Therefore, I will try to only use 60 mile an hour times without the 1-foot rollout throughout the course of this video. I'm also going to avoid prep surfaces like drag strips, since that's an unofficial gray zone that gives you an outside help on the traction front. And as Carroll Shelby once said, there's no such thing as too much power, only too little traction. But I have one last shout out I must give before I actually start tracking the history, and that is the founder of the recognized 0 to 60 test, Tom McHill. He was a road tester for Mechanics Illustrated, and 70 years ago, his word meant as much as Chris Harris's or James May's. So when he was testing the new 1946 Ford, he included a little blurb about how fast it reached 60 miles an hour on a stopwatch. And the readers couldn't get enough. He kept doing it, and used it as a comparison tool between rival manufacturers, and we still use it today. So with all that out of the way, let's finally get into the evolution of 0 to 60 times. Now, reaching 60 miles an hour doesn't sound very hard in this day and age, but back up 130 years, and it was pretty difficult. The first car, made by what would become Mercedes-Benz, had just 0.75 horsepower. So the first car to hit 60 miles an hour wasn't actually a production car. Instead, it was a PR vehicle for an electric carriage manufacturer called Compagnie Internationale de Transports Automobiles Electriques. No, I'm not going to apologize for that awful pronunciation because it's French. This PR vehicle reached 60 by being styled in the shape of a bullet, and it was powered by two 25-kilowatt electric motors, making a combined 68 horsepower, and it reached 65.792 miles an hour on March 4th, 1899. In fact, a production car wouldn't reach that speed for 12 more years. Yes, Mercedes-Benz 60 horsepower fans, that does mean that that car is excluded since it only reached 56 miles an hour in 1903, and that's according to the Mercedes Archives website. So instead of the Mercedes 60 horsepower, the first production car to reach 60 was the 1911 Austro-Daimler Prince Henry with a 95 horsepower 5.7 liter inline-4. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche, it reached a top speed of 85 miles an hour. Therefore, it did 0 to 60 in who knows how long. Literally no website had it listed. I don't know how that's possible. The internet's a pretty big place. I went to like 15 different websites on this stupid thing, and I couldn't find it. Which leads me to the only logical conclusion that they didn't actually measure it, because they were only worried about top speed at that time and not so much how long it took to get there, because you could probably measure it with a calendar. So, we are going to skip to the first measurement of a 0 to 60 time that I could find, the 1928 Duesenberg Model J. This luxury limousine had a 6.9 liter straight 8, making 265 horsepower and 375 torque. That's respectable for any era. And it propelled the doozy up to 60 miles an hour in 8.6 seconds, according to a road and track test from 1956, or slightly off the pace of a base model FC RX-7. That's very impressive for 1928, and I should note, like I did in my production car speed record video, the test may have been done in 1956, but the model year was 1928, and hypothetically, if the car was tested when it came off the assembly line in 1928, that would have been its time, which is why it counts as a 1928 record. So the doozy held the 0 to 60 record for a very long time, primarily because of the Great Depression, ending automotive performance development, and that whole World War II thing ending it even more. Specifically, the Model J held the record until 1952, when the Ferrari 212 Barchetta arrived. Sure, its 163 horsepower was just over half of that provided by the Model J, but acceleration equals force divided by mass, and there wasn't much mass in the 212. It only weighed around 2,000 pounds or less, depending on how it was coach built. So the Italian sports car hit 60 miles an hour in a scorching 7 seconds flat. The first ever Corvette came out just a year later, and it could only muster 11 seconds flat. Imagine being 4 seconds faster to 60 than the next best sports car. But there is also a caveat to the Ferrari 212, because while they did make 27 of them, enough for a production car classification, not all 27 were the same. In fact, the 0 to 60 times for the 212 Barchetta, since it was a coach-built vehicle, can range anywhere between 7 and 8.2 seconds, which still beats the Duesenberg, but the worst-case scenario of 8.2 seconds would mean that the V8-powered Corvette from 1956 beats the Ferrari to 60 by 7/10 of a second. And you know what? No matter what 0 to 60 time you look at for the 212, eventually it would get dethroned by a Corvette, specifically the 1957 C1 dual quad. This had the optional ramjet constant flow injection system to make 230 plus horsepower, and it decreased the Vette's time down to just 6.6 seconds. And then Ferrari struck back hard with the 410 Super America. It was based off of their 410S race car and had a 4.9 liter naturally aspirated V12 making 340 horsepower. It also had something that the Americans didn't have much of, a 4-speed gearbox, so the ratios were better for acceleration. And it had that in spades, 0 to 60 in just 5.6 seconds back in 1958. And that was enough to hold the crown for another very long time. Even with the rise of muscle cars in the 1960s, Ferrari were still the top dog. Yes, some will point out car and drivers tested the 1964 Pontiac GTO and how they recorded a 4.6 second sprint to 60, but I don't buy that for a second, because the specs for the GTO are worse than the Ferrari in pretty much every single way, and every other magazine that tested the GTO could only muster at best a 6.4, which is still very good and better for the money in some respects, but it ain't a 4.6. So instead, the 0 to 60 record would be taken by another American, Carroll Shelby, and his 427 Cobra SC. Only 31 were built after the racing variants weren't finished before the homologation deadline, and they were shoehorned onto the roads. So when you take a 2,200 pounds British roadster and stick essentially a GT40 engine into it, you get a rocket ship. The base model 260 cubic inch Cobra did 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds, and the 7-liter monster shrunk that time down to an unbelievable 4.5 seconds. Even legends like the Miura and the Ferrari 250 GTO couldn't match it. The next best car was the Chevy Corvette 427, and it could only muster a 5.5. That brutal speed does come at a cost for the Shelby. Drivability is severely lacking, if you would believe it. Turns out having nearly 500 horsepower in a 2,500-pound car in the 1960s with no electronic aids of any kind is kind of dangerous. But if you could tame the snake, nothing could touch it for over a decade. And that was because in the 1970s we entered the automotive dark ages. By 1974, the Mustang could hit 0 to 60 in a shocking 15.5 seconds. Even Ferrari wasn't immune, with their 308 only mustering 8 seconds flat. Porsche was actually the closest to beating Shelby with their 930 turbo, reaching 60 miles an hour in an impressive 4.9 seconds by 1978. But it was a far cry from the 427's speed, and we would need another golden era of automotive development to see change. And the 1980s gave us exactly that. Excess was the new success, and a renewed interest in motorsport led to crazier and crazier cars being developed. And yet it still wasn't enough. Even the Lamborghini Countach 5000 QV, the Buick Regal GNX, the Ferrari 288 GTO, they were all slower than the Cobra. Not by much, just a few tenths of a second, but nothing could beat it in terms of absolute time, until Group B rallying arrived in full force for 1984. Audi took their four-wheel drive Quattro Coupe, cut 10 inches off the front end, and added 300 horsepower to make a homologation version for rallying. And doing all of that not only improved the handling, but also improved the 0 to 60 time down to 4.6 seconds, which is, technically slower than the Cobra, which means it doesn't hold the record, I'm afraid. But I would argue it's a lot better to drive than the Cobra, being four-wheel drive. It's probably a lot easier to reach that figure than with the Death Trap Shelby. But still, as great as the Sport Quattro is, Ford ended up beating themselves. Following Peugeot's mid-engine lead, Ford built their first ever mid-engine production car, the RS200. Unfortunately, it actually followed safety regulations, which is something rare in Group B, and it was therefore heavy and therefore slow. So they took 24 RS200s out of the original 200 built and turned them into evolutions. It's technically one car less than the 25 usually required for a production car's classification, but that is so close to the limit, and who really cares? Especially when that was enough for FIA evolution homologation requirements, so it could actually compete in rallying. And this evolution of the RS200 got a retuned Cosworth 4-cylinder with a 23 PSI turbocharger kit added onto it and twin injectors to make nearly 600 horsepower and 400 torque in a 2,600-pound supercar with four-wheel drive and twin shocks on all four corners, because it's a rally car after all. The bodywork may have been built by Reliance, but rally legend Stig Blomqvist tested the Evo to a verified 0 to 60 time of 3.07 seconds. 3.1 seconds in 1986 with 3 pedals and a Ford badge. That is 1.6 seconds faster than the Ferrari F40. Hell, it's a tenth of a second faster than the McLaren F1. That $22 million legend achieved 3.2 seconds. Sure, there were faster cars like the Dower 962, but they were not produced in the same quantity as the Ford was. So we would see the end of the 20th century before the RS200's record fell. But fall it did when the mighty Bugatti Veyron arrived in 2005. Sporting the first ever production V16 engine, it was an automotive game changer, the champion of excess. Cylinders 16, turbos 4, power 1001, torque 922, drivetrain 4-wheel drive, luxurious, exquisitely so. Fast? Oh yeah. The Veyron set the record for the fastest production car in the world at 252 miles an hour, and it did 0 to 60 in just 2.5 seconds on the way there. The Veyron is not a light car, and yet the 2-ton hypercar went 0.6 of a second faster to 60 than the RS200 did. Granted, it took 4 times the turbochargers and 4 times the cylinders to do it, and a lot more money, and 30 years. But who's counting? It's the first non-Ford powered vehicle to hold the record since 1966, and Bugatti would retain the 0 to 60 record for a number of years with the revised Supersport model. Even faster cars like Koenigsegg's and the SSCs of the world couldn't beat the Veyron because of the pure acceleration of the all-wheel drive system. So if Bugatti was going to be beaten, another automotive revolution was required. The Hypercar Holy Trinity debuted in 2013. 2 of them, the McLaren P1 and the Ferrari, made over 900 horsepower to the rear wheels with hybrid assistance, to give them a 0 to 60 time of between 2.6 and 2.8 seconds. But the third member of the Trinity, the Porsche 918, made 887 horsepower with a hybrid system and, critically, all-wheel drive. So Porsche's claim of 2.6 seconds wasn't just believable. Many suspect that it was undersold, given that Porsche likely quotes their specs on dirty fuel with worn tires at the top of Pikes Peak just to guarantee that anyone can reach the specifications that they list on their website. So under ideal conditions, it was faster. Much faster. The 1-foot rollout time was 2.1 seconds, and even the non-cheaty time was 2.2. That's the fastest vehicle motor trend ever tested, road legal or otherwise. Porsche's hybrid drivetrain laid down the blueprint for future supercars, but unlike the Veyron or the Cobra or the 410, technology was advancing just too rapidly for that record to stay for a few decades. So first up was the 2021 Ferrari SF90 Stradale, which took the 918's drivetrain and added 100 more horsepower to reach 60 miles an hour in a guaranteed 2.1 seconds, no cheating required. Only for the Tesla Model S Plaid to beat it in just the same year, with a 1.98 second sprint to 60, the first ever sub 2 second 0 to 60 time for a road car. You wouldn't want to drive the Plaid at that speed because they hadn't put performance brakes on it yet, and besides, the Ferrari was way better through the corners. But if a 4-door sedan could trounce a 1,000 horsepower Ferrari to 60 miles an hour, electric cars were absolutely the future of acceleration. Oh, how right we were. Rimac is a battery manufacturer turned hypercar manufacturer, and it's leading the modern hypercar game. Its 1,900 horsepower all-electric powertrain is found in its own Navara and the Pininfarina Battista. At the end of 2022, the Navara beat Tesla by 0.13 seconds, only for Pininfarina to beat them by 0.06 seconds and smash the quarter-mile record while doing it. Now that posed a problem for Rimac since they can't be beaten by a customer, so they went back to Germany with the Navara and went for it. The team set 23 world records in May of 2023, including fastest eighth of a mile, quarter of a mile, half a mile, and standing mile times, with the quarter mile being done in just 8.2 seconds. Then they broke the 0 to 100 kph to 0, the 0 to 200, 0 to 300, and 0 to 400 to 0 record, with the last record meaning that the Nevera went from 0 to 248 miles an hour and then back to 0 in under 30 seconds. And then finally, they broke every 0 to insert speed here record ever invented, including a brutal 0 to 60 time of 1.74 seconds. That's almost as fast as a blink. And yet, technically, it's not the fastest time ever recorded by a production car. See, around the same time Rimac was rewriting the record books, Dodge was finishing off its last call send-off models for its Hemi V8s. And the last of the last call promised to be the greatest bang to ever go out on. The SRT Demon 170 is an evolution of the already bonkers Demon from 2018, only now it has 1,025 horsepower, 925 torque, and specialized road-legal drag tires. They actually delayed production because the guys who were building the tires didn't think they were good enough and tried to scrap it. And Dodge basically forced them, saying, no, you will get it right, because we're not releasing this car until you get it right. So, yeah, they were pretty serious. So serious that it has a spot on the back of it to mount a parachute, since you're going to need one if you want to use the 170 and an NHRA drag strip. And that is because NHRA rules say that any quarter mile time below 9 seconds requires a parachute. The Dodge's run was 8.91 seconds, with a 0 to 60 time of 1.66 seconds. All for less than $100,000 with full road legality. And an asterisk, because I would pay money if anyone could get that car to 60 miles an hour in 1.6 seconds anywhere other than a prepped drag strip. Those drag venues are so grippy that you can launch a 10,000 horsepower top fuel dragster to 350 miles an hour in under 4 seconds, and the Demon takes full advantage to reach that time. Don't get me wrong, it's an incredible vehicle, and a hell of an achievement that a heavy, rear-wheel drive muscle car can reach those figures. But have you seen any SRT launch on an unprepared surface? Good luck finding any traction there, which is why I don't consider the Demon 170 to be the fastest accelerating production car in the world, despite its impressive time. And it really doesn't matter anyway. Now that we're into sub 2 second 0 to 60 times, we are beginning to push the limits of what a road legal car can do just based off of physics. Not to mention the incredible danger of everything. People who buy these cars tend to have more money than sense, and it takes a highly skilled professional to drive these cars quickly. Skills that most owners probably don't have. Which means we now have the fastest cars the world has ever seen on the road, with a bunch of other idiots, and nobody in this story has any appreciation of how fast these things can go. And now that even a 9,000-pound Hummer EV can do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds or less, we are putting incredible power in the hands of people who will inevitably fail to respect said power. I really don't mean to be an alarmist, but I'm sure you've seen how people with high-end SUV and pickup trucks drive. Now imagine them with 900 horsepower and instant acceleration. Pretty sketchy stuff. But hey, at least petrol heads can still have fun when the gas runs dry.